Welcome, everyone, to the first lecture in the 2025 to 2026 lecture series hosted by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers Law School, entitled Free Speech and Racial Equality. Two topics that seem to be under threat at this period in American history. Today is September 11th, 2025, a somber day for all Americans, including those whose loved ones were killed because by the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and the first responders who died trying to save them, and also the hundreds of thousands and up to millions of people in the United States who were collectively punished for the last 24 years for the terrorist acts by 19 criminals. So it's important for us to both recognize the atrocity that happened in 2001 and condemn it, but also to recognize that hundreds of thousands and millions of people who are innocent in the United States and also abroad, Afghanistan and Iraq, who have had to suffer because of the response by the US government and also by people within the United States who blame Muslims for the atrocities. So as a result, this year we will be talking a lot about free speech. We'll be talking about racial equality. And we're kicking off this series with a talk about global Islamophobia. But before I introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Saher Selod, I want to encourage everyone to follow the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School in Newark, and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR or at RUCSRR on all of the social media platforms. I also have the privilege of being the host of the Race and Rights podcast, which you can subscribe to on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, et cetera, wherever podcasts are available. And also to subscribe to our YouTube channel where we put all of our former lectures as well as this one. We record them and we put them on the YouTube channel of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And if you find the work informative, if you find it helpful, if you find it important for understanding the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asian communities, which is the mission of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, then I encourage you to give a donation, ideally a generous one, by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and pressing the donate button. And it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce our guest, who will be speaking about or giving a lecture about one of her recent co-authored books, which has been quite groundbreaking and award-winning. So Dr. Saher Selod is currently the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. She was formerly an associate professor and previous chair of the Department of Sociology at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. Her research expertise centers on the experiences of Muslims with surveillance, and in her first book, which I also recommend, Forever Suspect: Racialized Surveillance of Muslim Americans in the War on Terror, she examines how Muslim men and Muslim women experience gendered forms of racialization through their hyper-surveillance because of the War on Terror. And her current book, or her most recent book, co-authored, is entitled A Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and 21st Century Racism, and it was published in 2024. The book examines how the global war on terror has justified the detention, imprisonment, and hyper-surveillance of Muslims in the United States, the United Kingdom, India, and China. So she takes a transnational and global approach. And I cannot overemphasize how important these issues are to the over 6 million Muslims in the United States and the millions, tens of millions, and hundreds of millions of Muslims in Europe, and in India and in China and in Australia, how Islamophobia has harmed them in very tangible ways through harassment, stalking, discrimination, physical assaults, death threats, and murder. So I hope that everyone who is listening today or is watching in the future takes Islamophobia seriously and learns more about its origins and its consequences and joins us in combating it along with other forms of racism and hate. And so with that, it is my pleasure to welcome to the virtual floor, Dr. Saher Selod. Welcome to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aziz. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen and get the presentation going. So hopefully you all can see this. So I do want to spend a moment to really thank Dr. Aziz for not only the invitation to speak. I'm also a faculty affiliate with the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, but for forming the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and for having this series on free speech, particularly in a moment where so many people are being threatened, not only, with imprisonment, detention, but also potential violence. So this is a very important series that she's put together. I also really need to thank Dr. Inash Islam and Dr. Steve Garner, who were my collaborators and co-authors of this book. Wish they could have been here with me today to speak. This book would not be Impress if it was not for the two of them. So very grateful to them. So I'm going to start with, sort of the obvious, that it's not lost on me that I'm giving this talk on the 24th anniversary of 9/11. 24 years ago today, I think some of us remember that day distinctly. We know exactly where we were when these attacks happened. Some of us might be too young to even remember this day and are growing up in a post 9/11 society. But I happened to be in Chicago. I was working at the Chicago Reader when the terrorist attacks happened. And for many Muslims who remember this day, things shifted very quickly for us. And it was something where we were both mourning, we were in shock, we were fearful for our country, but we started to realize very, very quickly that we were going to be targets of the backlash that would happen after this. So it is the experiences that I had myself and my family after this day that was the impetus for me to pursue a PhD in sociology. And that is where I conducted my first study that materialized into this book, Forever Suspect. So in this first book, I used qualitative interviews with South Asian and Arab Muslim American men and women, where I was really trying to understand their experiences in the United States after 9/11. And what I identified were the ways in which anti-Muslim racism was structured into society and how that actually impacted their day-to-day lives. One of the things that I was contending with, and Dr. Aziz wrote a wonderful book called The Racial Muslim. There are others like Deepak Kumar, Mustafa Bayoumi, Eric Love. Several of us have been grappling with how do we make sense of the racial experiences of Muslims in the context of 9/11. I rely very heavily on the work of sociologist Omi and Wanat, who have a wonderful theory called racial formation. And from that, I expanded on their concept of racialization and use this term to really discuss the experiences of Muslims with racism. So it was, at the time, race and race scholarship mostly focused on the experiences of African Americans and the history of slavery in the United States. So it was very difficult when I was first conceptualizing this to think about, well, how do I fit the Muslim experience into the conversation about race and the experiences of racism in the United States? So racialization is the concept that I've expanded on in the first book and defined as the process by which bodies become racial in their lived realities because of biological and/or cultural traits as a result of the intersection and cooperation between ideologies, policies, laws, and social interactions that results in the denial of equal treatment in society. In that first book, I am mostly focused on the experiences of South Asian and Arab Muslims in the United States. It is looking at, race in the United States. But racialization was the concept that really allowed me to talk about this. And it helped me move beyond just biological or phenotypical understandings of race in the United States. I bring this up because it will help situate what I'm going to talk about in the next book. Arguments that I and we in this most recent book do not make that I think are very important to note is that we are not saying that Muslims are a race in the US context. We are not saying that race is only tied to skin tone and biological features. And something that comes up a lot in definitions of Islamophobia is that anti-Muslim racism is an irrational fear of Muslims or Islam. And the reason I note this is there's nothing irrational about the racialization of Muslims. In fact, in all of my work, I argue there is a material motivation and benefit to racializing a group of people, whether it's Muslims or other marginalized groups, that it's not irrational, but it's actually structured into society to benefit some people. And then the last thing is this is not just about individual prejudice and bias, but this is about, we can have lots of conversations with individuals and explain to them that Muslims are humans, that they're not violent, that they're not whatever, but that we would still see racism against Muslims because of how it's been structured into society. So I will be going through this in my talk. The first thing that I want to note is that we have to understand what the social construction of Muslims are. What are the stereotypes that we're thinking about when it comes to Muslims? And I also want to note, in my new role at ISPU, we use the term Islamophobia at ISPU. In my book, if you read the book, you'll see in the introduction. This was written prior to joining ISPU, but that as an academic, I actually don't use the term Islamophobia, and I give my reasons why I don't use those terms, and I can answer that in a Q&A later. But I really rely on racialization and argue that these are the stereotypes that racialization relies on. It's that Muslims are foreigners, Muslim women are abused, Muslim men are abusive, violent, barbaric, terrorist. Islam is not a modern religion. It's an antiquated religion living in the past. Islam and Muslims do not belong within the nation state. They are a threat to national security and cultural identity. Now, ISPU on the American Muslim poll has an Islamophobia index where we ask questions and rank how groups fall on this Islamophobia index. So what constitutes that index? And I'll bring this up at the end of the talk. Again, I'll show you how we're using this index at ISPU, but it's similar to those stereotypes that Muslims are more prone to violence than other people. Muslims discriminate against women, so they're misogynistic. Muslims are hostile to the United States. This is a poll survey that's asked only in the United States. Muslims are less civilized than other people, and most Muslims are partially responsible for acts of violence carried out by other Muslims. So this index was created with the Georgetown Bridge Initiative and ISPU scholars. So we see now, what are the stereotypes of Muslims? If anybody has been studying about Islamophobia or the racialization of Muslims, you've read Orientalism, you know of Edward Said's work, you've read some of the scholars I just mentioned before, that these are the constructions of Muslims in which we see how laws and policies are put into place. So I want to sort of explain how, why did I decide with my collaborators to think about this more as a global phenomenon instead of just focusing on the United States. Just to be clear, and Dr. Aziz and the other scholars I mentioned before can all attest that it's been very difficult to make this argument that Muslims are encountering racism in the United States. Um, but as I was like, well, most of my work focused on Muslims in the United States, I was increasingly becoming more interested in a comparison of the experiences of Muslims globally. And this was due to headlines that I was reading about Muslims in the UK, in India, and in China. One of my collaborators, Steve Garner, lives in the UK. So we just started to dig deeper into what was happening abroad. And what we saw was we started to identify a thread in the experiences of Muslims globally. So I want to be very clear that the context of Muslim histories in each country is very unique. And each country is very distinct from one another. And also to be very clear that the end goal is very different for racializing Muslims within each country. So what's happening in China is very different than what's happening in the United States and the UK. However, what we noted is that the ways in which Muslims are marked, those stereotypes that I just showed you, are the ones that are still used across the globe, which justifies the discrimination, detention, imprisonment, and even in dehumanization and violence against Muslims globally. So it is that sharing of tropes about Muslims that has enabled what we're seeing, the dehumanization and the experiences of Muslims with discrimination across the globe. So in the book, what we do is in the introduction, we provide a theoretical framework for why racialization enables us to better understand the experiences of Muslim and why we're seeing a global racial enemy, So how is it that we can argue that this is something that is not just confined to the United States, even though, we talk a lot about 9/11 and the impact that had, but that the impact was global and it wasn't just confined to the United States. It is a global war on terror. And I should just note that these stereotypes of Muslims were not created with 9/11. They existed before 9/11. They just became institutionalized after 9/11. We also want to note that while I won't be highlighting this in this talk, that in all of my work, I always look at the intersections of gender, race, and religion. So gender plays a very large role in this. So chapter 1, we look at the Muslim histories. Chapter 2, Dr. Islam did an amazing job of presenting media representations in all of these countries and contexts for how we see the ideological construction of Muslims within each country. Chapter 3, we talk about the rise in nationalism and populism, so both ethno-racial populism within the context of the United States and the United Kingdom, and then in China and India, more state-led nationalism. What I will talk about today are these counterterrorism laws and policies and how the racialization of Muslims has been globalized through these. So what you might not be aware of is that it was the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 1373 in 2001 that we saw the global war on terror really take hold. And so the United Nations, introduced a significant new dimension to international counterterrorism law by requiring all member states of the United Nations to criminalize various acts associated with terrorism, as well as the participation in the financing, planning, preparation, or perpetration of such acts. The resolution emphasized the need to bring terrorists to justice through effective criminalization and requires that the punishment duly reflect the seriousness of such acts. This is from the United Nations website. So what this essentially did was it said that every member state of the United Nations had to start combating terrorism within their borders. So this was something that then we start to see it's not just the United States that's enacting laws and policies to combat terrorism. It's that this is a mandate that's asked of every country around the globe. As a result of this, we start to see copycat laws being put into place. So Arun wrote a wonderful report and a book. You can read that work on the sort of looking at the history of one of the policies called Prevent. So I put this slide in here because I think it's very important to note that, you know, in 2004, a filmmaker named Theo van Gogh was murdered in the Netherlands. And he had just made a film called Submission that many Muslims have, it's has a lot of anti-Muslim, sort of stereotypes and tropes. And so Muslims were very upset by this film that he had made. And he was murdered because of this film that he made. As a result of this, we saw the creation of a program called Prevent that was eventually adopted in the UK. And what this program did was the state started to identify ways in which they were going to surveil potential terrorists through ideologies. So not what people had done, not their criminal record, but what they were talking about, their speech, their language, their ideologies. So we start to see, a program being developed that is really expanding surveillance in the Netherlands, and then the UK copied this program and it became known as Prevent. That program is what Countering Violent Extremism in the United States, CVE, was modeled after. So I bring this up only to show you that this has always been global. Our counterterrorism laws and policies in the United States are influenced by counterterrorism laws and policies abroad that were developed and to be clear, in the Netherlands, there was no big threat of terrorism. This was one act done by an individual, yet you see the construction and putting into place these laws and policies that then go on to influence other laws and policies. Countering violent extremism was put into place by the Obama administration, and it was actually, a program where, federal money was doled out to different organizations that would try to weed out any kind of radicalization within their communities. So in the beginning of this program, Boston was one of the recipients of a CVE grant, and it was a mosque and Islamic center in Boston, where to receive this money, the leaders of the Islamic Center were supposed to report out any radicalized behavior that they were noting within their community. So this is a form of soft surveillance where community members are brought into the state to work with the state to identify potential, radicalized individuals. Now, this program has changed over time, and under the Obama administration, it was also geared towards white nationalists. When Trump became president in 2016, he eliminated looking at white nationalists and was really focusing on radical Islamists or Muslims in the United States. But the point is that it not only were mosques being targeted, the grant money started going to police unions, police stations, hospitals, schools. And so you have this expansion of surveillance, social services, social workers who are working with immigrant groups to sort of report to the state anything that they thought might be suspicious or evident of radicalized behavior. In the United States, we saw, in the beginning, many laws and policies that were put into place. The USA Patriot Act, which, greatly expanded the state's ability to conduct surveillance of its population, initially targeting non-citizens, It loosely defined what terrorism, what constitutes a terrorist or terrorism, and that's intentional so that the state is allowed to use its sort of expansive powers to surveil a population under the notion that's protecting the state from a national security threat. A lot of people protested several provisions of the Patriot Act. It was passed very quickly after 9/11. NSEERS is another example. It's a national security entry exit registration system, which was put into place under the Bush administration. This required, if you were a man, 16 and older, coming from one of 25 countries, you were required to register with the state where you were fingerprinted, you were interrogated, and you were photographed. 24 of those 25 countries were Muslim majority countries, even countries that the United States had good relationships with. So this is all showing you that in a moment of crisis, we put into place all of these counterterrorism laws and policies that were really marketed to the public in this notion of we need to protect the country from another potential attack. And so what influence does this have on other countries? And so in the UK, what we see is the Terrorism Act of 2000 and 2006. And so we start to see increased stops and searches at the border. We see NSEERS like programs in the UK, so where people are interrogated, fingerprinted. We have examples of DNA samples, phones, computers are checked. Something that, if I had given this presentation a few years ago, might not have felt so shocked or would have felt shocking to some extent. Most people don't know about these counterterrorism laws and policies, but I think even in this moment with what we hear our government officials talking about surveilling people's phones before they come into the United States, that we've had this in place for a very long time in the United States and globally. So preventative policing, this is using secret evidence where if you're accused of a potential act of violence or terrorism, then you don't have access to the evidence that the state is using against you. This was in the USA Patriot Act that we're seeing in the UK as well. In India, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. This is a counterterrorism law and policy that's been put into place where, again, a very broad definition of terrorism, not defining terrorism, but relying on these tropes of who is the potential terrorist. I highly recommend Lisa Stepnitsky's book on the history of terrorism and who we associate with acts of terrorism, which is part of the social construction of Muslims and the racialization of Muslims. We see warrantless seizures and searches, detention without being charged for 180 days. And within this, the provision of the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 2002, which was modeled after the USA Patriot Act within it. And so here you see a news article that's showing you that Muslims who were essentially organizing on their college campuses against the Citizenship Amendment Act in India, which, essentially said that if you were a Muslim, you were not allowed to access citizenship in India. And so there were protests on college campuses by Muslim students, and they were being detained as a result of this. So we're seeing, it being used in India, in ways that I'll tie it to the United States in this current moment, but ways that we, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have seen, like the state detaining people for free speech or speaking out or protesting against their government. And then in China, again, to understand what we're arguing in this book, you really have to read like the context of China and the history. We don't, we aren't able to provide, the in-depth history of China. I really recommend Darren Byler's work, Sean Roberts. There are other people who have written about China, but in this case, what we show is that under this new regime, Xi Jinping, we're noting that he's utilizing counterterrorism laws and policies for what Roberts calls as a form of settler colonialism. And that's the expansion of the Han population into this region, and it's a displacement of Uyghur Muslims. So the Regulation on De-Extremification Act, which was the counterterrorism law and policy that's being used, there are several articles in it, and Article 4, for example, states that religion has to be compatible with the socialist society. Article 9, that wearing or forcing someone to wear the burqa is seen as a crime, spreading religious fanaticism through irregular beards or name selection. So there's a lot of language in that's a lot more overt around targeting anyone who's is practicing Islam or is showing themselves to be visibly Muslim. And so we have here both, Byler in his book, In the Camps, talks about that you don't not only have these camps where if you are seen as participating in any of these criminal acts as defined by this Regulation on De-Extremification Act, you could be imprisoned into these camps that we know exist in China, but that also it's through surveillance of phones. So there's a virtual encampment that exists as well for many Uyghur Muslims in China. And so I just want to note that also in the book, we talk about how this is not just, that there's a material benefit to this. So we examine what is happening in these camps, and it's a form of, they are labor camps too. And so companies that are relying on labor from Uyghur Muslims who are in these camps. We also note that the government has also encouraged essentially, assault of Uyghur Muslim women by forcing them into these relationships with Han men in China. So it's not just surveilling men and putting them into the camps. It's also a surveillance of intimate relationships as well by the state. And we see that both in India and in China. So I'm sort of going to wrap up here with the contributions that we hope that this scholarship brings to academia and for those of you who are working on it. One is that racialization as a theoretical contribution to understanding Muslim experiences with racism. That racialization is a concept that we need to expand, and it allows us to think beyond, skin tone, phenotype. It also allows us to think about this as not West versus the rest. And that's where a lot of the scholarship, and I am a big fan of Edward Said's work, and he was really focused on the experiences of, Muslims and Arabs, especially thinking about colonialism and the history of colonialism. And it's not to say that that isn't the case or true, but that we see the global racialization of Muslims being utilized in India against Muslims in India and being utilized in China. And we could talk about it in Pakistan, where CVE is actually has been implemented in other Muslim majority countries. So something else is happening here, and we can't only examine it from this perspective of this is only about white supremacy. So global racisms share racial logics for different goals and for different means. And we also always have to keep in mind the gendered implications of these racialized policies. So we really hope that it opens up some more scholarship and discussions about the way we think about race. Now, policy implications, I think it's really important to go back to that Islamophobia index that I showed you that ISPU has created. What ISPU has discovered in our next American Muslim poll is about to come out, the 2025 one in October, is that the higher somebody in the United States falls on the Islamophobia index, the more likely they are to accept some of these other things. So the more likely they are to have a greater acceptance of military targeting of civilians, the more likely they are to have a greater acceptance of individual targeting of civilians, the more likely they are to have a greater acceptance of authoritarian attitudes, which means suspending checks and balances and limiting freedom of the press. And the greater support for the discriminatory policies we found in 2022 was linked to greater support for a Muslim ban and surveillance of mosques. And I brought this up because while this is focused on the United States, I do think that when the United States, particularly in the United States, but also globally, when we start to say that we're willing to give up, when we accept these tropes about Muslims, that they're such a threat, that the threat of terrorism is so high that I'm willing to give up all of our civil rights, this is how we start to see the dismantling of a free press, the dismantling of our civil rights laws and policies. And so I really highly encourage you all to read the next American Muslim poll, or to access the 2022 American Muslim poll that has more information on this. It's also on our website. We also have a study that we just launched on how in popular media, if we tied negative representations of Muslims to a general public's the more they were exposed to negative representations of Muslims, the more likely they were to accept anti-democratic policies and laws. So, it really is the stereotypes of Muslims are very damaging, not just to Muslims, but they have a much wider implication than just the Muslim population. And so I'm going to end with this and just sort of tie it back to what we're seeing right now in the United States, and thinking about, well, okay, that Muslims are 1 to 2% of the United States population. They're much larger globally, and you might not think that this impacts all of us, but it actually does. So, for example, ICE is the creation. It's a 9/11 policy. We didn't have immigration customs enforcement. And right now, what we're seeing, if you read our headlines, which are constantly shifting and changing, but recently Trump, and this is on the bottom left, Trump drug boat drone strike shows how terrorism makes everyone killable. So, his argument was like, we had the right to kill, these Venezuelan drug cartel because he's marking them as terrorists. And so this dehumanization of terrorists is so deep that it justifies the killing of anyone who is marked as a terrorist. And so, this is something that we really need to think about. ICE detention centers, who's put into these ICE detention centers, that we've seen a real connection by the state saying that they're preventing terrorism from coming into the United States by surveilling the borders. So not only is ICE a creation of 9/11, but also we're seeing that language of protecting the nation from terrorist attacks being used at the border and increasing our surveillance capacity and really funding more detention centers and saying we need more ICE. And then finally, one of the things that I think we're seeing right now in the United States and in the UK is using this, marking Palestinian student protesters or anyone who's protesting against the genocide in Gaza, that they're being accused of being terrorists. So I want to make it clear that there is anti-Palestinian racism, and I highly recommend that you look at the Institute for Understanding Anti-Palestinian Racism to understanding the distinctions between anti-Muslim racism and anti-Palestinian racism. But there is an overlap, and that overlap is that Palestinians, or anyone who's advocating for Palestine, the state is using these counterterrorism laws and policies to target them and to suppress free speech. around it, which is what we're seeing in the UK and what we've seen in China and what we're seeing in India as well. So I'm going to stop there and thank you very much for this opportunity. I know I threw a lot of laws and policies at you, but I welcome the conversation that we'll have next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Selod. That was, I know, just the tip of the iceberg, and I would recommend that everybody read her book, A Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and 21st Century Racism, because it is rich in information and analysis. And I will do a little bit of also self-promotion of a related book that's co-edited by me and John Esposito called Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism, in which Dr. Selod also contributed a chapter to. So we are starting to see more publications and an increase in literature about the transnational connections of Islamophobia, the common racial logics, right? The common ways in which civil liberties and civil rights are violated against first Muslims and then usually expanded. And I'll also put a pitch in for this new report that CSRR just published called Hindutva in America, a threat to equality and religious pluralism. You can find it at csrr.rutgers.edu under issues and also under our policy reports. So I wanted to start, I'll encourage people to put questions in the Q&A, but I wanted to start with something you touched on in the beginning of your, or at the end of your talk, which is the way in which we're seeing Islamophobia, especially in its relationship with the war on terror. We thought we were in the post-war on terror era, but we're seeing the same language, we're seeing the same policies be used now. The Venezuelan gangs or gangs that have a significant presence in Central America and South America being designated as terrorist groups, which is clearly an attempt to apply these highly rights infringing terrorist laws against narcotic gangs or against criminal gangs who, at least their criminal behavior actually doesn't fit the definition of terrorism if the definition is politically motivated violence intended to change state policies, to change state practices, or to, for example, overturn a regime. So what are you seeing in terms of that expansion of the kind of global war on terror? Let's keep it with the war on terror in the US.
Okay.
How is the current Trump administration expanding that to different communities? And also, how does it affect Muslims 24 years after 9/11?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just also want to note your report on fusion centers, which kind of also connects the war on terror to the war on drugs, which is really important because we have these fusion centers across the country. Everyone should read about these fusion centers. So to the point about the Venezuelan drug cartel, that now when you're marking people who are, criminalized for selling drugs or using drugs or whatnot, and you're marking them as a terrorist. And that strips them of due process now, so it justifies the use of the military against a drug cartel versus, local police. And we could critique, have a big conversation about how, policing happens in this country. But now you're talking about stripping any due process around, the ways in which we were dealing with the war on drugs. So there's a real crossover that's happening or creep that's happening with our counterterrorism laws and policies that are impacting now, not just Venezuela, but local policing around, which you show in that report. In terms of, thinking about this 24 years later, the thing that I tell most people is that Trump didn't invent any of this. Trump, even in 2016, he just inherited it, and he's not afraid to expand it. So what we're seeing in this moment, and you as a lawyer, a law professor, know way more than I do about the legal system, is that you have a moment where you have a Supreme Court who is really essentially saying the executive branch has much the scope of the power of the executive branch is much larger, whereas we were seeing other branches potentially rein it in a bit. And now you have national security laws and policies that have been in place, since 9/11 that are now being used. In fact, in this moment, it's very different from 2016 too. In 2016, it was like he was campaigning on Muslims and, Latino, Latinx. That's who he was targeting when he was campaigning. Now he's targeting the left and anyone who speaks out. And it's sort of that, I feel like it's shocking to a lot of people in this moment that how can this happen? And it's like we've been telling you, because you've been talking about, I've been talking about, other people have been talking about. When you start putting into place, when you start stripping away the human rights of people, or civil liberties of people in the United States, it will eventually creep out to be used against anyone who dissents against the government, who is protesting on their college campuses and whatnot. I think still we have to still recognize that when we saw the government go and detain people for speaking out against the atrocities in Palestine, we should really note who those people were first, because it was Muslim and it was people who were on either a green card or visa. So Mahmoud, Remeza, so these are people like Muslims still are very vulnerable. We've always known that, when we say anything, we're going to be scrutinized and potentially marked as a threat to national security. But the impact is much larger than us,
Well, and that brings me to another question and report, which I'll promote here, presumptively anti-Semitic, Islamophobic tropes in the Palestine-Israel discourse, which we published in 2009, actually 2019. I co-authored, or 2023, excuse me, I co-authored it with Mitchell Plitnick, who's on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace, and we published it with CSRR. And one of the reasons we published this piece, which we've been working on since 2021, so it happened to come out in the fall of 2023, but that was just fortuitous or completely coincidental that it came out at the same time that Hamas committed war crimes, and then Israel responded by committing a genocide, which it continues to commit until today, September 11th, 2025. And the reason we were working on this project was because we were finding that it has become almost a standard Islamophobic trope or anti-Muslim racial trope that Muslims are anti-Semitic, that they're presumed to be anti-Semitic, that they're presumed to hate Jews, without any evidence, without any specific, without any evidence. It's just you all are assumed to be anti-Semitic, just like you're all assumed to be terrorists, just like you're all assumed to be dangerous or misogynistic, and you individually have to prove otherwise. And that's racist and it's offensive. It is just as offensive as alleging that all Black men are gangsters or all Latino men are members of the cartel, or so on and so forth. So what we've witnessed in the last 2 years, at least, much before, also before 2023, but I think in 2023, it really came to the forefront in terms of the way in which anti-Muslim racism was being manifested, and it was converging with anti-Palestinian racism under the guise of combating anti-Semitism, which was effectively to expel students from universities, to harass, stalk, intimidate, threaten faculty, to attempt to fire anyone who speaks out against the genocide in Israel or criticizes Zionism. So very, very vicious and malicious campaigns against those individuals by private actors, and then legitimized by the government and by politicians. I mean, we have Josh Gottheimer here in New Jersey, who is extremely aggressive in not supporting or being opposed to the work of our center, even, right? To essentially try to shut down institutions and to harm people who are trying to defend the civil rights and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians. as opposed to seek to investigate and prosecute a particular case where the facts are clear that there is anti-Semitism or there is racism against any particular group. So I'm interested to hear when you were watching, we're all watching, right? The horrors happening in Gaza, the genocide, the mass starvation, the bombings of civilian buildings, the murder of over 100,000 people and injury of hundreds of thousands more. I mean, it's absolutely atrocious. And then we're also seeing the collective punishment that's quite vicious and weaponizing law to hurt those that are speaking out. Right? With the face of that, the targets being Muslims and Palestinians. And so it does remind me of the war on terror quite a bit. And it's expanded because as we're seeing, there are Jewish students, there are Black students, Latino students, white Christian students, and faculty and Americans who are now starting to be persecuted, right, for their human rights advocacy and anti-genocide of political activism and speech. So how does your research, or what's your, when you're watching all this, how does your book inform your analysis, and could you illuminate that for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to Palestine, I mean, Palestine could have been a case in this book, and many other, I mean, the history is very different in Palestine. All of these histories are very different, but I think what we're seeing is exactly what you're saying. The minute there's an attack or a violent attack by, let's say, particularly a Palestinian, or Hamas in this case, that the dehumanization is so intense that the justification for what was met with violence, the violence that met that violence was and continues to be, justified. And I think, the book informs in that we're seeing this over and over and over again. Like if an attacker, so in the United States, if there's a terrorist attack, and if it's a Muslim, we're going to wreck laws and policies overnight to combat terrorism in the United States, even if it's an individual who's operating on their own, and it's a quote unquote lone wolf. If that shooter is not Muslim, but is potentially, somebody who's white, it doesn't have the same kind of response that it has in terms of the types of laws and policies that get erected very, very quickly. And so I think that, you're bringing up a very interesting point that we really need to contend with, recognizing what anti-Semitism is a problem, and it is on the rise. And actually at ISPU in the 2022 survey, one of the things that we highlight is that Muslims and Jewish, because we oversample Muslims and Jewish and a general public, they are both experiencing rises and experiences with discrimination. Now, Muslims are Muslims are reporting it at a higher level, but Jews in the United States are also experiencing it. They're experiencing anti-Semitism, and part of that is, and it ties into that book, the co-edited book you have, where is that coming from in the United States? It's the same groups that, are targeting Muslims, that are targeting synagogues, mosques and synagogues. It's, in the context of the United States, we're seeing manifestos being shared, between shooters of both. So, anti-Semitism is a real problem, Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism, that's a real problem. However, what we're seeing in this moment is that a critique of a government that's committing an act of violence against a group of people is being conflated with being anti-Semitic or discriminating. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that's helpful. And just to clarify that common group are white supremacists.
Yeah, I mean, these are like you in the book, I talk about it, and the article that I wrote is that looking at white supremacist ideology that we saw in the shooting and Christchurch shooting, and then the Tree of Life Synagogue, and then if we look at the the black churches and whatnot, that the sharing of ideologies is not just in the United States; it's actually global, right? So even in the UK, so that we cover in those ethno-nationalist and state-led nationalism, even in the state-led nationalists like China, that some of the rhetoric that we read about in online was mimicking some of the language that we were seeing online from white nationalist, white supremacist groups in the United States. So we talk about that it's not that there is something happening, but that it's not only in the service of white white supremacy in the case of China and in the case of India or whatnot. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Selod, for this informative talk. And I hope that it has persuaded our viewers and our followers to read your book, A Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and 21st Century Racism. I also hope that it encourages people to sign up for all of the lectures in the Free Speech and Racial Equality Lecture Series. Our next one is next Wednesday, September 17th. We will be hosting Dr. Ra Siegel, and I will be joining him in conversation about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. IRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and why that particular definition is erroneous and why it is a threat to Palestinian civil rights as well as free speech rights. And the reason why it's worth a panel is because, unfortunately, from my perspective, that erroneous definition of anti-Semitism is being used as the gold standard in many state legislatures, and in New Jersey, they're also trying to pass it. And the objective of those who support the IRA definition of anti-Semitism is to effectively punish through abuse of law anyone who criticizes Israel as a racist endeavor or a settler colonial project, or criticizes Zionism in a similar way, among other kind of belief-based or speech-based acts or speech. And so again, similar to what we were talking about today, once you start taking away individual rights, in this case, free speech rights, and once you start demoting the dignity of particular groups where you're trying to privilege one group over another, it's just a matter of time before it expands to you, right? And before it becomes normalized, and then we continue down what I think is an authoritarian slide at this point in history, sadly. So I hope people will take advantage of our lecture series, learn, agree, disagree, debate. We're a free country still. We're trying to keep it that way. You can go to csrr.rutgers.edu/free speech to register, and also follow us on social media, RUCSRR, Rutgers CSRR. And then finally, if you find these programs beneficial, if you learn, even if you don't agree with everything that the hosts, the experts say or analyze, but if you find them to be important contributions to the marketplace of ideas, to the public discourse, please donate to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button, and please give generously. And with that, thank you so much, Dr. Saher Selod, for your generosity in sharing your expertise and your time.
Thank you so much.